So I was playing Assassin's Creed Unity, as one does, and honestly, I've lost times of how many times I've played that game, because even after the millionth run, there's something about its dark, somber tone that keeps drawing me back into this game. It's a game that, in my opinion, perfectly captures the essence of what I believe Assassin's Creed should be, and I've got a couple reasons as to why I do think Assassin's Creed should be more dark and serious. And to me, Assassin's Creed Unity is a good reminder of the days when the series dared to tread darker paths, where the Brotherhood was more than just a club of dangering rogues or mercenaries or adventurers going on some epic quest, but an ancient order at war with the hidden and oppressive forces of the world. It was an order that, by most people's definitions nowadays, would be considered terrorists. And, depending on the perspective, you can consider them freedom fighters, you can consider them avengers, but at the end of the day, they were a group of pretty dark and disturbed people. And this is something that I find deeply appealing and immersive about certain games in the Assassin's Creed franchise. I've often mentioned how there's still fun to be found in the more colorful entries in the series, particularly the ones developed by Ubisoft Quebec. If you don't know, Ubisoft Quebec, up until this point, is basically responsible for two of the main Assassin's Creed entries, and that is Assassin's Creed Syndicate and Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And unsurprisingly, those are the two most, humorous, light-toned, quote-unquote funny, because I don't actually find them funny.
His loss?
Yeah. I'm sure he can put this to better use than I can.
Oh, what's this, Greenie? Assassin Christmas.
But kind of doesn't take themselves too seriously Assassin's Creed games. Those two games are the ones that are most unlike any other of the entries in terms of tone and in terms of how serious it takes itself. And I find it really interesting because it's clearly a studio decision or a studio philosophy that Assassin's Creed shouldn't really take itself seriously over there at Ubisoft Quebec. And that's something that is clearly incredibly different when you look at Ubisoft Montreal. Ubisoft Montreal is basically responsible for the rest of the Assassin's Creed games, bar Rogue and Mirage, I believe. And you can see that even if the quality varies between all the entries that they are responsible for, they always have this overarching philosophy, which is one that I agree with, which is that they have to take the IP that they're using seriously. And there's, in my opinion, two incredibly important reasons why any franchise, but specifically Assassin's Creed, work better when it takes itself seriously, when it adopts darker tones, more realistic tones, and doesn't create caricatures out of the characters that it's using. It doesn't create jokes out of serious moments, and it doesn't take the subject matter that it's exploring lightly. Now, before I explain these two reasons, I want to make it very clear that I don't think that a game taking itself seriously or being dark means that there's no space for humor. I'm not saying that every game should have zero humor and never have anything funny in it, because A, I don't believe that, and 2, that's not true. Even games like Assassin's Creed 1 or the Ezio trilogy or AC Origins and even AC Unity does have moments of humor in it. It does have those more light or comedic relief moments. My overall point is that there's a difference between having humor in your IP or in your work of art and not taking it seriously. And I believe that Ubisoft Quebec doesn't take itself seriously. When you play Assassin's Creed Syndicate and you play Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you can see that the lore, the existing material, the philosophy, and the ideas of Assassin's Creed as a franchise are not really respected, but kind of more acknowledged in a meta way and then made fun of or not really taken seriously or respected. And I'm basically going to explain the main two reasons why I believe that a franchise should. Number one is because of where Assassin's Creed, or rather when Assassin's Creed takes place. It's a game that goes back into history. And I don't know if you've picked up a history book in the last few weeks or few months or in the last few years, but any history book that you can read will basically inform you that up until the last 80 years, and honestly in a lot of parts of the world even today, the world is kind of a shitty, dark place. And I don't think what I'm saying is too controversial at all. So when you have a game that is set in a realistic rendition, a accurate, faithful recreation of a certain point and place and time, the likelihood that it's going to be a happy and upbeat place is essentially zero. And if you're trying to create an immersive experience that makes you respect the IP because you see how the IP respects the places that it's kind of resurrecting from the dead, you kind of need it to be a dark place. Not only visually, which a lot of the Assassin's Creed games achieve, because, even Syndicate, that doesn't take itself seriously, has a dark city and kind of lives in a dark place, but also tonally. You have to understand that the subject matter you're dealing with is extremely dark and morbid for the average person now. We're dealing with things like murder, corruption, we're dealing with assassinations, illness, sickness, poverty, exploitation, sometimes slavery. These are very dark and heavy topics, and you can't approach this work of art just making jokes and not understanding the mechanisms in which your story is taking place or the world in which your story is taking place. So the first reason is that Assassin's Creed has decided to explore a very dark aspect of humanity, which is its own history. Its own history is riddled with so much darkness that if you want to tell a story about freedom and liberation and hope, you have to first acknowledge that there's something you have to be free from. You have to acknowledge that there's something you need to be hopeful about. You have to acknowledge that the assassins are doing work for a reason. And if you look at Syndicate and if you look at AC Odyssey, they feel more like adventurers in a fairy tale or in some sort of like fable, because all of these issues and all these villains, all these characters, all these problems that the characters involved with seems very one-dimensional. It seems very cartoony, and it doesn't really seem to respect the gravity of the situations that you would have had in that period of history. Whenever it seems like the game is about to adopt a more serious tone, there's always a comedic relief character in both of those games that tends to shatter that even for a moment. And for me, it's kind of like the Marvelization of Assassin's Creed. It's something that Ubisoft Quebec has done, and I think they're going to do again in Shadows. I know Shadows has been delayed, and there's been a lot of conversation about Ubisoft and potentially Ubisoft selling and the disaster that Shadows is going to be. I'm still cautiously optimistic. I don't want to be an overly negative person when talking about a game that we haven't played yet. There's a lot of things about Shadows that I'm impressed with, but there's one thing that I know is likely going to irk me and is going to annoy me, which is the tone that Shadows adopts. I don't think that Shadows is going to be a particularly dark game, even though it's going to explore a pretty dark period in time, and the fact that we can compare it to Ghost of Tsushima, which is a dark game because it's in a dark period of time, I'm just not that confident that I'm going to like that tone, because again, it's Ubisoft Quebec and they don't seem to believe in taking the IP seriously. And so that's my first reason, which is that Assassin's Creed has to do with history, and history is dark, history is serious. And of course, as I mentioned before, you can have humor within that, but the overarching frame in which that humor exists has to be, I think, much darker and much more serious. Now, the second reason is more personal to me, and that I think is much more subjective than the first. So if you disagree with this opinion, feel free to share it in the comments. Let me know how you feel about this, or if you agree, or if you like your games being a bit more humorous than maybe I do, and really I'm just an edgelord. But the second reason is because for me to become a fan of something, and for me to take an IP seriously, the IP has to take itself seriously first. Because honestly, just think about it. Most of the things that we're fans of aren't real. Most of the things are sci-fi or fantasy, and they're basically fiction. So what a storyteller or a company or a game publisher or a novelist or whoever is creating the IP that you like, what they're saying is basically, here is a bunch of things that aren't true, and for the entire duration of you consuming this falsehood, I want you to act as if it was true. That's basically the interaction between storyteller and the consumer. And for me to do my part in that interaction, for me to do that part in the agreement between creator and consumer, the creator and the work that he creates has to take itself seriously. I want Assassin's Creed to lay out a bunch of rules about its universe, and then I want it to respect those rules. And that's the problem with Ubisoft Quebec. It understands those rules, in my opinion, but it doesn't really respect them. It does things with them that go against the philosophies and the original intentions of those rules, and sometimes just breaks those rules for its own creative purposes. And again, that's more subjective, because you can agree or disagree with the breaking of those rules for the betterment of the story, but because I don't think it betters the story, because I think it only invalidates that story and all of the ones that came before, I think it's a bad decision. But what I'm basically trying to say is that if you have a story that takes itself seriously, then you are allowed to take it as seriously as you want. I can find the humor in the Ezio trilogy because I know that the Ezio trilogy will consistently be faithful and respectful to the rules that it's laying, in terms of its narrative, in terms of its characters, in terms of what the characters will acknowledge as a real danger and what they won't, in terms of how the characters will react to real tragedy rather than not doing it or joking about it, the way that the characters' motivations are aligned with and fueled by the disaster or tragedy or injustice that they're seeing in the actual world. Ezio doesn't just feel like liberating Venice or Rome or any other city. Ezio sees the real damage that is being created, takes it seriously without making any jokes, and then creates a real action plan that he then actually delivers on, that is, first of all, a smart action plan that's realistic, that is not going to just sound stupid the second you say it out loud, and then executes that plan. Within that framework, within that seriousness, he can make jokes and quips and be charming. And this is the same for Assassin's Creed 1. Altair completely takes what is being told to him seriously. And seeing Altair take things seriously when Al-Mualim talks to him, or when his targets talk to him when they've been assassinated, you as the player can then take it seriously. I mean, imagine if Altair went around killing these 10 targets that he was tasked to do, or he went around talking to Al-Mualim, and every time that some revelation came up or some philosophical observation came around, he just made a fucking joke. Or like you had a dialogue option to like not believe it or make a quip or just leave. You would never ever take AC1 as seriously as people did back in the day, because AC1 wouldn't even take itself seriously. So why should you? This is my overall point about creating investment, creating immersion, and creating a fan base. You need your work of art to take itself seriously. Now, it's a bit more nuanced because obviously there's a bunch of works of art that have gotten famous off of not taking themselves seriously. But even then, the point about consistency in its rules is what is taken seriously. So for example, Deadpool, that's known for not taking itself seriously, for fourth wall breaks, and for always kind of like making fun of everything and shitting on everything. The point that I'm trying to say by taking itself seriously doesn't necessarily mean it has to be dark, it has to be serious, it has to be unfunny. It means that it has to take itself seriously, as in consistent with the rules, respect the rules, and always respect the person who is consuming your IP by giving them what they expect in terms of rules. So Deadpool is never going to not break the fourth wall because it takes itself seriously. Deadpool is never going to not try and be funny and charismatic and shit on things and make shitty jokes because it takes itself seriously. Taking itself seriously is respecting the rules that you've laid out. And I think that's kind of what I want to address and that I've talked about before in different places. That nuance between something being serious and taking itself seriously. I think that Assassin's Creed as a franchise and as a whole works better when it takes itself seriously, and I think that it also works better when it is dark and serious. But those are two different things that I think work very well together, mainly because A, history is extremely dark and serious, and B, I am more likely to become a fan and feel rewarded for my investment if the franchise that I'm invested in is constantly reminding me and fueling that in-universe logic and in-universe explanations for motivations, philosophies, and overall factions and just characters overall. So this might be a little bit of a controversial opinion. I'm not sure how controversial the first point about history will be, but definitely the second one. I think some people definitely like a bit of humor in their franchise and like it when the franchise doesn't really take it seriously. So I'm actually really curious as to what you think, and if you're new to this channel, maybe even Assassin's Creed, and you want to see my opinion on what Assassin's Creed is a good idea to play first, you can watch this video now.